25,000 Iraqis killed as a direct result of combat or armed violence, according to a later Swiss review of the study's data. A subsequent study by Iraq Body Count found 25,000 non-combatants reported killed in the first 2 years of the occupation. In Baghdad, 1 in 500 citizens. In Fallujah, 1 in 136. U.S.-led forces killed 37%, criminals 36%, anti-occupation forces 9%. Killings doubled in the second year of the occupation. Most deaths were caused by explosive devices, 2/3 of these by airstrikes. The estimates of Iraq body count are based on media reports and are therefore surely well below the actual numbers, though shocking enough. Reviewing these reports along with the UNDP Iraq Living Conditions Survey, April 2005, British analyst Milan Rai concludes that the results are largely consistent. The apparent variation in numbers resulting primarily from differences in the specific topics investigated and the time periods covered. These conclusions gain some support from a Pentagon study that estimated 26,000 Iraqi civilians and security forces killed and wounded by insurgents since January 2004. The New York Times report of the Pentagon study also mentions several others, but omits the most important one in The Lancet. It notes in passing that no figures were provided for the number of Iraqis killed by American-led forces. The Times story appeared immediately after the day that had been set aside by international activists for commemoration of all Iraqi deaths, on the first anniversary of the release of the Lancet report. The scale of the catastrophe in Iraq is so extreme that it can barely be reported. Journalists are largely confined to the heavily fortified Green Zone in Baghdad, or else travel under heavy guard. There are a few regular exceptions in the mainstream press, such as Robert Fisk and Patrick Coburn, who face extreme hazards, and there are occasional indications of Iraqi opinion. One is a report on a nostalgic gathering of educated westernized Baghdad elites, where discussion turned to the sacking of Baghdad by Hulagu Khan and his vicious atrocities. A philosophy professor commented that Hulagu was humane compared with the Americans, drawing some laughter. But most of the guests seemed eager to avoid the subject of politics and violence, which dominate everyday life here. Instead, they turned to past efforts to create an Iraqi national culture that would overcome the old ethnic religious divisions to which Iraq is now regressing under the occupation, and discussed the destruction of the treasures of Iraqi and world civilization, a tragedy not experienced since the Mongol invasions. Additional effects of the invasion include the decline of the median income of Iraqis, from $255 in 2003 to about $144 in 2004, as well as significant countrywide shortages of rice, sugar, milk, and infant formula, according to the UN World Food Program, which had warned, in advance of the invasion, that it would not be able to duplicate the efficient rationing system that had been in place under Saddam Hussein. Iraqi newspapers report that new rations contain metal filings, one consequence of the vast corruption under the U.S.-UK occupation. Acute malnutrition doubled within 16 months of the occupation of Iraq, to the level of Burundi, well above Haiti or Uganda, a figure that translates to roughly 400,000 Iraqi children suffering from wasting, a condition characterized by chronic diarrhea and dangerous deficiencies of protein. This is a country in which hundreds of thousands of children had already died as a consequence of the U.S. and UK-led sanctions. In May 2005, UN rapporteur Jean Ziegler released a report of the Norwegian Institute for Applied Social Science confirming these figures. The relatively high nutritional levels of Iraqis in the 1970s and 1980s, even through the war with Iran, began to decline severely during the decade of the sanctions, with a further disastrous decline after the 2003 invasion. Meanwhile, violence against civilians extended beyond the occupiers and the insurgency. Anthony Shadid and Steve Faineru reported that Shiite and Kurdish militias, often operating as part of Iraqi government security forces, have carried out a wave of abductions, assassinations, and other acts of intimidation, consolidating their control over territory across northern and southern Iraq, and deepening the country's divide along ethnic and sectarian lines. One indicator of the scale of the catastrophe is the huge flood of refugees fleeing violence and economic troubles, 1 million to Syria and Jordan alone since the U.S. invasion. Most of them professionals and secular moderates who could help with the practical task of getting the country to run well.